But I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to get stuck right in and start talking about some key principles in economics which have deluded and eluded both our economists, but also, more importantly, our policymakers and politicians, and the consequences are disastrous. So economists have got a lot to answer for, including the unemployment of young people. The bankers have admitted, and this was a newspaper headline which appeared very briefly, some in the moment between 2008, 2009, when there was a moment of kind of regrets from big bankers, and then that changed very quickly and they returned to their usual bullish self. But they admitted they had failed and caused the crisis. Now, Martin Wolf says that we're in the midst of what is said to be the longest and among the most costly of Britain's depressions in over a century, that this depression, Jonathan Portes recently produced a chart to show that this depression is longer and deeper than the Great Depression. And the characteristic, he says, compared with its predecessors, is the frightening weakness of the recovery phase. We've been talking green shoots and recovery now since 2009, and we're now in 2012. Every month or so, some little thing happens which encourages everyone to try and spin the recovery. But as Martin says, this is not appearing. Now, the reason for this is not complicated, although very few talk about it. The reason for this is the build-up in private sector debt in Britain. Britain is one of the most indebted nations on earth, and that has a lot to do with our financial hub, the City of London, which is the creator of debt, of course, and of credit. And this chart appeared in the government's budget statement last year. It was the first and most important chart, I thought, in the budget. I put it up on Newsnight as my chart of the year because it shows you the scale of private debt in the UK. And the reason why I find the chart so interesting was that the government failed to include in this public debt. This is only private debt. And I think there was a reason for that. And the reason is this one here. This is a chart from, McKinsey Global Institute. Yes, this is McKinsey Global Institute. And it's a pretty chart. And guess who can spot the public debt? Here's public debt. This is Britain's public debt. And it's about this issue that, you know, almost all of public and political and policy debate is currently focused. We have very, very little discussion about those mountains of private debt, which are currently having to be deleveraged or written off because they're not being repaid. The news this morning told us about how much debt RBS has written off. Hundreds of billions of debt, which they know will never get repaid. And with every young man that's made unemployed, or every person that's made unemployed is not able to pay down their credit card or their mortgage, the bank's debts get worse and worse. And Britain is amongst the worst. And this is, again, a McKinsey report with the share of public and private debt. It's a bit out of date, but it's quite hard to get these numbers. In fact, McKinsey has produced a report since, and I should really have got you those numbers. But they haven't changed substantially. So you'll see that of all the debt, the public debt, the 52%, is really not the most important part. What is really important here is the share of financial, which is the banks and financial institution debt. And this is a comparison of debt across economies. And Britain is amongst the most indebted, as you can see. They explain this or excuse it by talking about Britain as a global financial hub. But look at our public debt compared to, for example, that of the United States, which is 60%, of Germany, 69%, of Canada, 60%, of France, 73%, and of course of Italy, 101%, as it was then. So really Britain's not in this as deep a doo-doo as we all get told we are, but the biggest problem we do have is the scale of private debt, but that tends to get ignored. Nevertheless, the whole of public debate and policy debate is on the need to cut the deficit. And I fear that this is a debate majored on by George Osborne, and I think for good reason. Who wants to shine a light on the activities of the City of London? But the opposition collude in this too, by saying that the public deficit is the most important threat that we face. Now, the question that we ask, and we've written a report which I recommend you read, is does cutting expenditure and tax raising, will it cut the deficit? Now, the generally accepted thing is if we cut expenditure and we raise taxes, as we've done, we've put up VAT, we've put up a wealth tax up to 50%, is this going to cut the deficit? We argue that won't be the case, but we say that it's not between cutters and postponers or deficit cutting and stimulus. I am strongly in favour of cutting the deficit, strongly in favour of cutting the deficit. But the debate is between expenditure cutting and stimulus. Which of these two things will cut the deficit? I hope this is not too talking down to you because, but I know that many people don't really get the economics of this, the macroeconomics of it. Government is not in a position to control its own deficit or surplus. Dear Mr. Osborne, the Office for Budget Responsibility, the Treasury, they just have no control whatsoever over the deficit. And it's really important for them to understand that. They don't understand that, or if they do, they confuse all of the public who believe that they do have the ability to control the deficit. Now, you and I, we can control our deficits. We're very small beer. If we want a surplus, we cut our expenditure to raise income. But what we do is not, or we raise income. What we do is not important to the economy at large unless all of us do it simultaneously. Government spending is too important for that. The size of the budgetary outcome depends not on government, but on the entire economic system and its reactions to the government's plans. That's what will determine the deficit, not the Treasury, not Mr. Osborne, not the Office of Budget Responsibility. So there's a fundamental error that it's not possible to assess the stance of fiscal policy, to come to a view on fiscal policy from looking at the public deficit. It's a bit like saying, looking at my overdraft will tell you something about the scale of my mortgage. This is not it's not an adequate comparison, but it really is, that's not what we can't assess the stance of what we should be doing in fiscal policy by looking at the deficit. You wouldn't think so, of course, because everybody looks at the deficit as the stance on fiscal policy. Now, what Keynes has argued, and what he has proved, is that an expansionary fiscal policy leads to growth in activity and employment, so that in a recession, high public sector expenditure reduces debt and hence the deficit. So if we're going to we want to reduce the deficit, we mustn't look at the thing the wrong way round, which is what Mr. Osborne is doing now. So the question becomes, who will cut the deficit, the slasher or the spender? Now, before we answer that question, I want to address another major problem in economics, one of the major delusions of economists, their ability to use microeconomics to arrive at and to predict macroeconomic conclusions. And the finest example of this was an example of our Chancellor, brilliant man, we're told. He says to the Tory party conference in October 2010 that Britain has a deficit, a structural deficit, very fond of this term, structural deficit. Structural deficit means it never changes, I've never really understood what structural deficit means. Anyway, there's a deficit and a deficit. And he says that it's like a credit card. The longer you leave it, the worse it gets, he says. And I can tell you that all those Tories believe that it's like a credit card. If you do opinion polling, everybody is saying the government is right. I've got to balance my budget. I've got to cut expenditure when I get out beyond my means. The government must do the same. And this lesson they've learnt at the feet of our Chancellor, and indeed, if I may say so, of some of his opposition, of the members of the opposition. Now, I hope this is not sounding patronising, but I just want to go through why the government budget and credit card balances are not the same. First of all, the government can cut spending, but it can't cut its deficit. You, the credit card holder, can. The government, believe it or not even if it's called Zimbabwe, can go bankrupt. No. Greece can't go bankrupt. That's that's why creditors love sovereign loans, because sovereigns don't go bankrupt, but the credit card holder can. Government spending generates income and saves on benefits and interest rates. Not for you and me. When I hire someone to insulate my home, a building company, I pay money into their bank account, and none of it accrues back to me, except perhaps if I make savings, energy savings in using insulation. But government spending generates income, something called the multiplier, which had been forgotten by economists, I have to say, for decades. I'm pleased to say the term multiplier is returning to the language. Government can conjure money out of thin air. Think of quantitative easing. The credit card holder can't do that. And this is absolutely fundamental to the delusion of most economists. Most economists think that banks don't and cannot create credit. There's this very old-fashioned theory that Mrs. Jones puts her savings into the bank and then Mr. Smith comes along and borrows her savings. And there's an even more old-fashioned theory, something called fractional reserve banking, that Mrs. Jones only puts £100 into the bank and then Mr. Smith can borrow £1,000. Fractional reserve banking hasn't existed in Britain since 1694 with the founding of the Bank of England. And banks do not have money in the bank. They do not have vaults of savings that they lend to borrowers. It hasn't been so since 1694. It wasn't so before that in Florence, in Holland, and in France. It's a myth. They don't have that. Keynes was quite right with his monetary theory, which has been ignored, and I'm not surprised that the City of London kind of draws a veil over Keynesian monetary theory. Lending creates deposits. When I apply to a bank for a £300,000 mortgage, there is no money in the bank, but there is a clerk and a manager and a ledger. What happens is the bank enters £300,000 into the ledger or into a computer and transfers that bank money to my account once I have signed a contract, pledged collateral, my property, and promised to repay at a certain rate of interest. That money arrives in my bank as a deposit, and I begin to spend it. Only a very small proportion of it is cash. I haven't time to go into that. But monetarists who dominate economic theory and who, in my view, at the cause of this huge blow-up of credit, believe and argue that deposits create loans, that banks don't have the power to do what they've done to the British economy, which is create this massive, huge bubble of unpayable debt. So the reason they do think like this is because they understand money as a commodity, which they sort of think is subject to supply and demand, to marginal utility, etc. They talk about stock and the velocity of money and money circulating and so on. It is a thing, they think, and money is no such thing. The orthodoxy argue that we can only afford what's already in the bank in the form of savings or deposits or gold. Hence all the excitement about the gold price at the moment. So they believe that that's all that you can spend, and that's all money that we can have in the world. And Keynes showed, very rightly, that that is utterly, utterly untrue. And it has been untrue since we very cleverly, as a civilization, developed a banking system. I work a lot in poor countries and with poor countries that don't have a banking system that can create credit. They don't have credit cards, that walk around in Nigeria, for example, with plastic bags full of paper money. Hundreds and thousands of millions you have to add them up like this with elastic bands and carry them around. They don't have a banking system. We have, thank God, a banking system that works, or did until 2007. So the old Hayek rap, this is a clever rap devised by some Wall Street guys. If you're living high on that cheap credit hog, don't look for cure from the hair of the dog. Real savings come first if you want to invest. In other words, we can't afford to create jobs for young people because there ain't any money in the bank, says Mr. Osborne. And that is a lie. It's the biggest economic lie, and it's the most destructive. And now, as I'm getting all het up, I'm losing my place. Here we go. So Keynes argues that credit creates economic activity. Economic activity generates income, and income generates deposits, savings, tax revenues with which to repay the debt. It's a beautiful circular process, and Keynes understood it back in the 1930s. What he understood has been buried. But when we do understand it, it's beautiful. The Bank of England creates credit out of thin air. Thank God they did. $16 trillion between the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, and the ECB to bail out the banking system in 2008-9. Before that, most ordinary people had never heard of anything called quantitative easing. But the Bank of England has been doing that since 1694. They called it monetary operations. They gave it different names. But it's been around. That's what's kept the economy going. So 5 minutes. So anyway, there we go. Let me quickly get to my point here. So what we can create, we can afford. We can't afford more than we can create. We can't afford to create stuff that's going to destroy us. But we can create. What we can create, we can afford. So in a monetary economy, as opposed to a barter economy or whatever, the relevant consideration is the availability of finance, not savings, and there need be no constraint on finance, ever. And we found that out when we found that suddenly we could find $16 trillion to bail out banks, and we didn't tax a single person to find the money. Credit, unlike gold or oil, is not a commodity, and there need be no limit to its creation. Of course, there are limits, and they have to do with inflation and deflation, and I'll go into that because I'm sure that's going to be a question that will come up. And because it's therefore not subject to the laws of supply and demand, its price, or the rate of interest, should necessarily, and it's a social construct, it's determined by a committee sitting in the Bank of England and by individuals in the banks, in the British Banking Association. It is a social construct. It's not a result of market forces of supply and demand. It should always be low. So when banks are charging struggling small companies today 20% on their overdrafts, you know there's something deeply unnatural going on. So employment is not constrained by finance or income. Income is only earned through employment. You and I know that. When we have no job, we have no income. Work makes things affordable for us. Work makes things affordable for the state as well. And therefore, high unemployment makes the state pretty unaffordable. Using QE, the Bank of England, 2009, created 200 billion quid in new credit. They used this to buy government bonds. They used this to finance Mr. Osborne's deficit. The banks received new money because they had the bonds, and that became deposits brought into existence through QE. So they issued £200 billion in 2009, another 75 in October 2011, and then the day before yesterday, £50 billion to bring to a total £325 billion, which is effectively paying for Mr. Osborne's deficit. So I won't deal with that. We can deal with that in the group. So government deficit, therefore, is financed by domestic finance, which gives the lie to the fact we need to borrow internationally. Poor old Greece has to borrow in what is effectively a foreign currency for her, but we don't. We can borrow, and the Americans can borrow, and the Japanese can borrow in their own currency, a currency linked to the level of economic activity in their country. So we've produced this report, The Economic Consequences of Mr. Osborne, and we've shown that government spending reduces the level of debt overall, and except in the case of world wars. So you'll see here between 1909 and 13, the expenditure rose by 4.3% and the debt fell by 1.5%. During World War, it rose massively, and the debt rose massively, by 17%. Between 1918 and 23, a period of economic contraction, expenditure fell by 29%, and the debt rose by 13%, and so on and so forth. So we take you through these periods in history, and we show that the only times in which this does not happen is when the excessive expenditure to finance war. There are some beautiful numbers here, and I don't think I have... How much more have I got? I'm nearly there, aren't I? We can do this in the session, actually. So we can show you... What I want to show you here is that government public expenditure has been stable almost for a century at around 20%. It starts off at 10% or so in 1909. The two big loops are the two world wars. And then after that, it scarcely moves over above 20%. It's a thoroughly stable percentage of GDP. This is a beautiful chart. This shows you what happens to public debt over time. And I don't want to go into too much detail, but this is where Keynes takes over the economy effectively in 1933-34. 4 years after the crash, Keynes takes control in Britain and Roosevelt takes control in the United States, and they start spending, and the debt falls dramatically. And I think I've got a chart which shows you unemployment falls as well. Until 39, when, of course, the debt rises dramatically, and we reach this point in 45, when the debt hits 260%, roughly, 250% of GDP, post-war. Today, it's about 60%, moving up to 70%. What happened then? The Labour government started spending. It spent on the health service, it built the health service, it built public housing, it built roads, it introduced the Education Act, it started building schools. It spent like there was no tomorrow. And that's what happened to the debt post-war. Went from 250% all the way down to about 20%, and it starts to rise, actually. This doesn't show it. It starts to rise with liberalization, but that's another story. Similarly, in the United States, in the United States, Roosevelt spends, and he doesn't just spend on the Hoover Dam and on fixing the forests, but he invests in culture, in music, and in Steinbeck, for example, is sponsored by Roosevelt and so on. And what happens to the debt is that it begins to fall. This is a very dramatic chart from the IMF, which shows you G7 public debt from 1950 to 1970. This is the period of the Bretton Woods when Keynesian economics is dominant. And then after 1970, we see what happens. The blue line is G7 debt. The red line is advanced economies, the world, and emerging and developing economies. And we see it rising inexorably as economies are liberalized. So these are the unemployment outcomes in Britain and the United States, post-spending. You can see it very dramatically. This is this Britain, and here you see it very dramatically post-war, and also in the US post-war. Unemployment falls. So since government can't control the deficit, trying to reduce the deficit is looking at the problem in the wrong way. The way to reduce the deficit in a time of unemployment, climate change, and peak oil is to spend, preferably wisely on green technology to promote energy security, climate security, and job security. Look after the unemployment, said Keynes, and the budget will look after itself. So this is the name of the document, and we have a couple of other documents on our website, primeeconomics.org. So I recommend you go there. I recommend you read Jeff Tiley, Keynes Betrayed, and then my book, which is a bit out of date, but in 2006 it was called The Coming First World Debt Crisis. It fell like a stone and was laughed at and ridiculed, but it's gained me enormous credibility since. Thank you very much.